Now, it's been a dramatic first year in charge for Humza Yousaf, with the SNP leader facing a series of political challenges since he entered Butte House last March.
What were some of the biggest events during that turbulent 12 months? Joining us to discuss this now is Sunday Times journalist John Boothman. John, a very good morning to you. Chart, if you can, the very turbulent situation that Humza Yousaf inherited, and then how the 12 months since have gone.
I think the two words that you've used so far, dramatic and turbulent, well, those are kind of pretty illustrative. Other people might say a car crash. I mean, he inherited a very bad situation from Nicola Sturgeon. She had been popular post-COVID, but the gloss had gone over her. Her resignation was a surprise. There was a really divisive election contest, which really Humza scraped home in. 1% of the vote he won against Kate Forbes. He then, rather than hold out the hands of friendship to his opponent, who was more popular with the public, he shunned her and left her on the back benches. We then had, and look, we can't forget, the big blue tent in Nicola Sturgeon's garden, the camper van, all that carry on. She was arrested, as was her husband, and then released without charge. That story still rumbles on. He spent the year reversing a lot of policies, but hasn't had any credit for it. The one big electoral test he had was a by-election at Rutherglen. Labour got 55%, knocking the SNP out in that situation. The polls are bad for the SNP, Labour biting at their heels. The approval ratings of the Scottish Government are low on just about every one of the measures. On the plus side, I suppose, he's got a council tax freeze. There were no NHS strikes in Scotland. The SNP has a big signature policy where they give £25 a week to every child under the age of 16, the Scottish Child Payment. But, you know, he's a guy who seems, over the course of the year, more to have been at the mercy of events rather than in control of events. So it's been a difficult year for him personally. Of course, he had those difficulties with his parents-in-law being stuck in Gaza when the war started. Thankfully, that was resolved. But, you know, it's not been a good year. The next few weeks are going to be difficult because it will be a year on from all those events that I just spoke about with Nicola Sturgeon. And the election prospects for the SNP don't look particularly good either.
Just in terms of that, of course, the Conservatives keen to capitalise on that, and Labour as well. You mentioned Rutherglen and Hamilton West there. A 20% swing away from the SNP. The Conservatives have actually given a list of the failures under his leadership. Every A&E waiting time has been missed, rise in violent and sexual offences. In that time, they've managed to publish 9 independence propaganda papers costing £134,000. I think it's also worth saying that Scotland is the drug death capital of Europe.
Look, you know, there are all sorts of issues about focus and authority and grip round about Humza Yousaf. You know, that focus on independence when the public really want to focus on the cost of living and, as you say, the NHS, I think it's been a problem for the SNP. They don't have a particularly big strategy in independence. They say they were elected on a mandate to do that. But do you know what? It's not where the public are at the moment. And that's a huge issue for them. Those fundamental problems that you talk about in the NHS, some of them, I think, obviously go back to COVID, but they were there a long time before that, are just things that the SNP seems unable to solve. Really, they've been in power since 2007, and there is a real sense, I think, amongst the public that they've just run out of ideas, and that's the problem that Humza Yousaf has. There's a sense that they're just there, him and his ministers, they want to cling on, they want to stay there, and they don't have any particular answers to take the country forward.
John, if that's the case and there's been this sort of sliding in confidence from the public towards the SNP, who's sort of soaking up that public appetite instead?
Well, it's clearly the case that, and I think you have to go back to those 40-odd days when Liz Truss is in charge. After that, what happened in Scotland, rather than the SNP getting the credit because of Keir Starmer and Anas Sarwar in the Labour Party, Labour really started getting the credit. If you look at the opinion polling at the moment, kind of roughly equal in terms of percentages, but it looks as if Labour could win more seats in Scotland at the general election. They are the party who are clearly on the way up. It has to be said for the Conservatives in Scotland, despite the problems that the Conservatives have got south of the border, the Conservatives have dropped in the polls in Scotland, but they could hold on to the 6 seats that they had. They still think they could win a couple. So at the end of the day, the SNP have set themselves a target of winning 29 seats at the general election. It's not an ambitious target, given that they won 48 the last time. But it's clearly the case that Labour, who won only 1 seat in Scotland in 2019, they could end up overtaking the SNP on a very, very good day. They certainly look as if they could win at least maybe 15 seats and upwards of that.
And how much of this is down to his poor leadership of the SNP? How much of this is Sturgeon being an Achilles heel? And is there any kind of appetite to replace him?
I think there's a bit both, right? It's clearly the case, as I say, that the gloss had gone off Nicola Sturgeon before she's resigned, and it's got worse since then. Humza Yousaf's approval ratings are actually worse than Nicola Sturgeon's than she left. As I say, he suffers from the fact that he's really got no grip on events. He seems to lack authority. His judgment is often poor. So, yeah, there's a problem there. Is there an appetite to replace him? Now, I think he's determined to stay, whatever the result of the election. But I think it has to be said that I don't think I'd quite put it in saying that other people are on manoeuvres, but I would be looking at Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader, as a possible contender should Humza Yousaf go. And of course, I think you can't rule out Kate Forbes, who came so close the last time. They're two very different people. Stephen Flynn, I would say, is probably regarded as being on the progressive side of the party, in the same type of mould politically as Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf. And clearly, Kate Forbes has a very, very different appeal. She comes from the Highlands. She's regarded as more economically savvy than the SNP. I think she is someone who would reduce the size of government and do very, very different things. But look, after the general election, if the SNP were to replace their leader, there'll be, perhaps if it's in October, the election, there'll only be about 18 months to the next Scottish elections. And that's where, we'll see whether that period in power that the SNP have had since 2007 could possibly even come to an end.
We will see. John, thank you so much for analysis of what's happened over the last 12 months of Humza Yousaf's leadership of the SNP. John Boothman there from the Sunday Times.